Okay, as soon as you see the live button, you're good to go.
Okay, so we're streaming live. Um, it's my great pleasure to be with you tonight as an advocate for what's widely known as modern monetary theory, the idea, the fact really, that the federal government is the arbiter of what is possible in our economy, and what is needed more than anything is the political will to think outside the box of mainstream austerity thinking and recognize the old adage, everybody does better when everybody does better, is eminently possible. How we get to that political will is, as in most things, a matter of education and groundswell. We're all likely here as political activists of one stripe or another, often coming from a frustrating background of being told that we don't have the money to do the right thing, from healthcare to climate change, from education to transportation. But what if we do have the money? What if we've always had the money? That a better future is within our grasp if we just alter our thinking on how our federal economy works. On that note, my name's Jason Call. I'm a candidate for Congress in Washington's 2nd Congressional District. I'm an advocate for modern monetary theory economics because I'm an advocate for Medicare for all, for addressing climate change at the scale we need to survive, for rebuilding our infrastructure, our transportation systems, and for doing all of this and more through a federal jobs guarantee at a living wage. Joining us tonight is someone I've watched and learned from intently over the last year. He's a leading thinker on MMT and has spent countless hours in education forums just like this one, providing the evidence and the rationale for changing how we tax and spend so that our government functions for all of us. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University in Ohio, so he's on East Coast time. He's president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and his work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, to build resilience and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. You can find him on Twitter at Fadhel kaboub and at GISP underscore tweets. We'll go ahead and put that in the chat. And just for housekeeping purposes, Fadhel is going to give a presentation. The webinar will allow you to ask questions in the Q&A section, not the chat. We'll be asking some of the questions at the end of the presentation. Presentation is going to be around 50 minutes. We'll have the Zoom open and available for some amount of time after the presentation for the Q&A. I'm going to select those that I think will be the most informative to what we want to unpack here. So if I don't get to yours, we'll keep a record of those questions and see if we can get them answered at a different time. And without further ado, let me introduce my friend Fadhel kaboub. Fadhel, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Jason, and thank you everybody for hosting this event and for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and you tell me if this is working. Do you see my PowerPoint here?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, let's make it full screen, and hopefully, do you see the full screen or do you see the slides on the side?
Slides on the side.
Okay, let's try this. How about this?
Perfect. Full
Okay,
screen.
wonderful. All right. So what I want to talk about today is, as Jason had mentioned, is MMT, modern monetary theory, which I've been part of this MMT community for the last 20 years or so as an academic, but most importantly in the last few years as somebody who's been working with a lot of political candidates, activists, who were really trying to answer the question, how are we going to pay for it? We have all of these ambitious, progressive programs to tackle the climate crisis, to tackle healthcare issues, infrastructure issues, so many problems, including the pandemic, expenditures that we're dealing with right now. And the standard approach to economics, which is what most mainstream politicians embrace, both on the right and on the left, Republicans and Democrats, tells us essentially that in order for us to spend, we need to tax somebody or spend from somebody or borrow from somebody, which means at the end of the day, we're going to have to be pretty modest with these ambitious programs and kind of bring them down to kind of a centrist perspective on what is affordable and what we can do. And with that, we can't really tackle the climate crisis and the pandemic and all the socioeconomic issues that we deal with. MMT offers an alternative. And today I'd like to introduce you to this. And it's a realistic perspective. This is not pie in the sky kind of theoretical impossibility. This is how the system actually works. but I'll highlight what some of the constraints are and where we can move this conversation forward. So with that, I want to start with why we need to be radicals, why we need to be bold. Radicals, not in the kind of pejorative sense of the term that many people have been using over the last at least decade or so, but radicals in the linguistic sense of the term, meaning going to the roots of the problem. If we're not going to the roots of the problem, we're treating the problem from a superficial standpoint, which means we're simply reproducing the status quo. And that's just not acceptable at this point. We have deep structural problems on the climate front, on the inequality front, on the socioeconomic exclusion front, on the political front. We have a dysfunctional political system. And yet the establishment is looking for incremental bipartisan solutions, which I would call superficial status quo reproducing solutions. So that's why we need to be bold and radicals, going to the roots of these problems. And again, we have systemic problems, structural problems, which means we need to go to the roots with radical solutions. The opposite of radical change is superficial change, and that is not affordable at this point. We can't afford that. Martin Luther King Jr. said in the context of the civil rights movement, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism." In the same sense today, we have no time for these tranquilizing drugs. The political establishment and the dysfunctional political system we have is trying to convince us that incremental bipartisan solutions is the way to go. And for me, that's a textbook definition of the status quo. The IPCC report gave us less than 10 years now we have left to implement massive transformative solutions on a global scale. That is not incremental solutions that we need today. And let alone the socioeconomic issues, the healthcare issues, the pandemic, all of these things require massive transformative policies. And to me, the Green New Deal is this umbrella program that captures quite a bit of this progressive agenda, of this bold transformative agenda on multiple fronts. So these deep structural problems that I highlighted a minute ago also include the opioid crisis, low-paying jobs, which something like a Green New Deal will be able to address. Housing, education, health, all of these things are included. And we can't say, oh, let's start with the green stuff and then later worry about housing, and then later worry about health, and then later we can afford the additional. We need to do all of these things at the same time in a transformative way, just like we did during the New Deal to some extent in the 1930s. So what is the Green New Deal? It's federally funded. This is not going to be a financial burden on states and municipalities. It's locally implemented in a decentralized way. This is a way to revive participatory democracy. Local communities will decide what the priorities are, what the needs of the community are. And none of this can be determined effectively by a central planning authority in Washington, D.C. So this is what we mean by participatory planning, participatory budgeting, participatory auditing, but the funding must come from the federal government. It needs to be urban and rural, and this is true in pretty much in every state. I'm in the Appalachian region here in Ohio, in central Ohio, but we see the disparities between urban and rural in terms of infrastructure, access to broadband and transportation, you name it, and access to healthcare. But the same is true in Washington State. The same is true in Wisconsin. The same is true everywhere else. So we can't tell people to move to the cities if they want the better quality of life. We need to create jobs and improve people's quality of life in both urban and rural areas. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be just and restorative. Inclusive in the sense that we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the New Deal of the 1930s, which did exclude African Americans, for example, and wasn't inclusive and just enough. Just in the sense of a just transition, and that is not just for fossil fuel workers, but for any other workers in any other industry that will be displaced by this massive transformation, including healthcare, by the way. We're going to have, if we transition to Medicare for all or something of that sort, we're going to displace a lot of paperwork pushing individuals in the private sector today. And that's not their fault. That's why we need to have a job guarantee that literally guarantees a transition to gainful employment for anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work as we build this transition, but especially for fossil fuel workers as we decarbonize the economy. So a job guarantee with living wages and benefits and dignified workplace conditions and so on. And for those of you who are interested in the job guarantee, I'm happy to discuss it later in the Q&A session, but I urge you to take a look at Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's job guarantee resolution, which came out just a few days ago. A fantastic resolution that all of us should be supporting and asking our representatives and senators to endorse and to introduce as a formal legislation in the months and to come. It needs to be restorative in the sense that it needs to restore the broken social fabric that we've lost, to be honest, over the last 4 decades or so. Social, ecological, economic fabric that's been dismantled with the neoliberal economic policies that we've put in place. It needs to be comprehensive and permanent in the sense that comprehensive, meaning we can't just start with the solar panels and wind turbines and say we'll deal with health and education and infrastructure later. We need to do all of these things at the same time. And this change, this transition to decarbonize the economy needs to be permanent. There is no going back to the old ways of producing energy, transporting and organizing the economy the way we've done over the last several decades. And there's no going back to the massive inequality that we've created in the last 40 years, because this inequality was not created by accident. It was by design, by policy design. So no going back to those to that system. So the big question then, which is what I would like to discuss in depth today, is how do we pay for it? How do we pay for this massive transformative program that people say will cost trillions of dollars that we don't have and we can't afford? We're told that the government is broke, we're running out of dollars. The rich will never agree to pay higher taxes to fund all of this, liberal, pie in the sky or whatever. The national debt, we're told, will be a burden on future generations. We're told that there'll be inflation, hyperinflation, like in Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Weimar Republic. And we're told that we can't, be borrowing even more money from China, right? More dollars from China. I'm inviting you here to call their bluff today. And when you learn the basic concepts of the MMT approach, you'll be able to recognize this BS immediately and call their bluff. So let me ask you this. How did we pay for World War II? The most expensive program in US history at the time. And it came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. There was no money to be taxed during the Great Depression. There was no money to be borrowed during the Great Depression, domestically or internationally, because the Great Depression was global. So where did the money come from to pay for this massive intervention to win World War II? Can you imagine if during that transition from the Great Depression to World War II, Congress and FDR were debating, should we maybe send 10,000 troops to Europe and see if we can scare the Nazis? Do it incrementally every 2 weeks, send them 10,000 troops? Of course you can't. That's why we won the war, because we were able to marshal and mobilize those massive resources immediately in a very short amount of time and do it all at once. So the question during the period when the US entered World War II was not who are we going to tax or who are we going to borrow from. The question was, do we have enough skilled people to mobilize and produce the actual physical resources, the tanks and airplanes, to actually win the war? So the focus was actually on producing the stuff to win the war, not finding the money. Do you know how we find the money in Congress? We get 535 people to vote and approve the spending. The federal government has the power of the purse. It spends money into existence. That's how we did it during World War II. And by the way, that's how we did it for the CARES Act. And that's how we're doing it right now as we speak. as Congress is voting another $1.9 trillion COVID relief spending. Nobody today is talking about who are we taxing to get the $1.9 trillion or who are we borrowing from. It's not even an issue. The issue is, do we actually have the productive capacity in the economy, for example, during the war, to build the airplanes, the tanks, and so on. So at the time, during World War II, the concern was, we have the votes in Congress and we have the money to pay the workers to produce the tanks and airplanes. The question becomes, when those workers take their hard-earned income for producing the tanks and airplanes and so on, and then they go home, they are actually free to spend it. And if they wanted to spend it, it's a free country. They can buy new houses, they can buy new cars, they can buy whatever they want. The problem was, we didn't actually have anybody available to build new houses, anybody available to build new cars for them. So what would have happened had those individuals gone out on a shopping spree to buy new houses and new cars, they would have caused inflation. So what did we do? Not before the war, but during and after the war, we went into a new mode of tackling the risk of inflation by offering those individuals an opportunity to abstain from consumption, to postpone their consumption of new homes and new cars until after the war. So what did we do? The US Treasury started selling war bonds, freedom bonds, kind of to capitalize on the patriotic mood of the nation. But effectively, we're simply asking those individuals not to spend, not to add to the additional pressure on housing and transportation and entertainment and you name it, whatever people want to spend their money on. Because those physical productive resources were actually scarce, because we shut down the city of Detroit. We shut it down from producing automobiles for consumers, and we shifted it completely to producing war materials. Right? So we didn't have any cars available to be bought. We didn't have construction workers to build new homes because they were building for the war effort, or they were fighting the war in Europe or in Japan and other parts of the world. So that is the question. It's always about the risk of inflation and do we have the physical productive resources? It's not about finding the money. When we went through the beginning of this pandemic almost a year ago now, nobody said, who are we going to tax, who are we going to borrow from? Literally 535 elected officials in DC, with the exception of 3 or 4 people who actually either had COVID or were exposed to it, who couldn't actually vote in person. 100% of those present voted in favor of the CARES Act relief spending for the pandemic. At the time, if you remember, Trump and Mnuchin came out and also said, by the way, those taxes that you normally pay on April 15th, don't worry about it. We don't need your taxes. We're going to postpone that to July 15th. So the government didn't even need the regular taxes, let alone add new taxes or add additional borrowing. That's how the federal government always spends. This is not the exception. This is the rule. The federal government always spends when you have 535 people, or the majority of those 535 people, approving the spending. The concern that we should always have is, what is the risk of inflation? So now we're moving deeper into this territory. And what I will immediately jump in and tell you is that I'm not saying that spending is unlimited. There will be a limit, but that limit is not tax revenues and it's not borrowing. So let's talk about what are those real limits. MMT, or modern monetary theory, highlights this concept of monetary sovereignty. The US federal government has a high degree of monetary sovereignty, which means the federal government issues its own currency, the US dollar. The federal government collects taxes in that same currency, the US dollar, and the US federal government only issues debt, US treasuries, government bonds, denominated in US dollars and only in US dollars. Lots of other developing countries issue debt denominated in foreign currencies, in which case they actually lose their monetary sovereignty. Not the case in the US or Japan or Canada and most industrialized countries, or UK, Australia, you name it. And fourth, and most importantly, that the The exchange rate that we have, the value of the dollar is not fixed to gold or silver or any other foreign currency. Many developing countries who have a very low degree of monetary sovereignty end up fixing their exchange rate to the dollar or to the euro or to the Japanese yen or a basket of those strong currencies. So the US enjoys this high degree of monetary sovereignty, which gives us a very large spending capacity that we can tap into, but we're currently not. An important distinction that MMT makes that I will urge all of you to remember is the distinction between the issuer of the currency, which is the federal government, versus the user of, or the users of the currency, which is the rest of us, including states, municipalities, your local village council. All of those entities operate like you and I. They have to earn an income when they tax their residents in order to spend. They can borrow up to a certain limit from the municipal bond market or whatever. But beyond that certain limit, they can't really have unlimited spending or additional spending. You and I operate the same way. We can borrow from a bank, we can borrow from a friend, but up to a certain limit. So we're constrained in how much we can spend by our revenues and by how much we can borrow. The federal government, as I said earlier, has the power of the purse, has this additional spending capacity that's not unlimited. I'll tell you what the limits are, but it's substantial, and we're not tapping into it on a regular basis, or at least not for the right priorities. So warning, don't try this at home. This is for the federal government. This is not for your municipal government or for your city government or for your state government or for you at home or for your business. You can't, do what I'm describing here. This is the federal government. So you can think of a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. And on this end of the spectrum, you have countries with very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, like the US, like Japan, Canada, and so on. On the opposite end, you have countries with essentially no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. A country like Ecuador that completely gave up its national currency and now uses the dollar, which means it's the equivalent of the state of Ohio or the state of Washington. It's a user of the currency. It doesn't have that additional spending capacity that I'm talking about. Most developing countries are somewhere in between. What determines the degree of their monetary sovereignty is really the level of external debt that they have. How much debt denominated in foreign currencies do they accumulate? Notice the US, Japan, Canada, the entire debt stock of the United States is in US dollars. So there's no risk of insolvency. The entire debt stock of the Japanese government, which has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, 250% as we speak, the entire debt stock is in Japanese yen. So zero external debt, which means it has a very high degree of monetary sovereignty, which means when it spends, there is no risk of insolvency. When it issues bonds, there is no risk of insolvency. So what is this real limit that I'm talking about to the spending capacity of the federal government? The mainstream approach tells us taxes is what funds government spending. We can expand it a little bit by borrowing, right? The government is issuing government bonds. But what MMT is saying is that there's this additional spending capacity that we're not tapping into on a regular basis. That's not unlimited. Notice this red bar here. The red bar, which is the real limit, that's the risk of inflation. MMT economists are obsessed with inflation or the risk of inflation, unlike what most critics say that MMTers don't care about spending, don't care about inflation. Absolutely not. It's the exact opposite. Everything we focus our work on is what is the actual limit, because we're trying to estimate how much additional spending space do we have. And that's what I want to zoom in on today, because this is not rocket science for astrophysicists to understand. This is common sense that I promise you in the next few minutes you'll be able to understand. And I think it will have a transformative effect on the way we think about politics and the way we think about what policy options we have in the United States. So the real limits is the risk of inflation that I'm talking about here. So what determines that risk of inflation? That becomes really the real question. For me, the first real limit that actually causes inflation is the shortage or lack of productive capacity. In other words, when we run out of skilled people, raw materials, hospital beds, solar panels, equipment to produce stuff technology to produce stuff. That's what I call productive capacity. When we run out of those real physical things and the government still wants to spend beyond that and buy more of that stuff, of course, it's going to cause inflation. So the good news here is that productive capacity is producible. We can build more hospitals. We can train more doctors and nurses and engineers. We can build more solar panels. And the good news is that it creates millions of jobs. So with the proper strategic planning and industrial planning, we can actually expand our productive capacity. And as we expand our productive capacity, we create millions of jobs, and we make this yellow space actually larger because we're expanding the productive capacity. We're pushing the risk of inflation further and further away. That's the easy part. That's a kind of no-brainer part that we should be doing immediately. Number two is tricky. And the second risk that actually increases the risk of inflation is what I call abusive market power and price setting behavior. In other words, we have key corporations in the economy. Think of big pharma, big tech, your telecom companies, Wall Street, you name it. All of those entities that have the capacity to raise prices simply because they can, because they dominate the market, because the market is not competitive enough, because regulators let them do it, lawmakers let them do it, right? So this risk of inflation is not going to go away with austerity policies. It's not going to go away if we slow down the spending. That risk of inflation only goes away if we tax and regulate their market power out of existence, if we democratize those markets and make them more competitive. And who's responsible for taxing and regulating industries? The 535 people we sent to Congress and Senate. The problem is, if those 535 people are brought to you by super PACs, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. And that's why when we say take money out of politics, this is what we mean, because it's this abusive control of the market that actually suffocates our spending capacity and tells us, you know what, we can't spend more because we already spent it on tax cuts. We already spent it on military, so we have no more money to spend. But it's really the price setting behavior and the artificial shortages that we create in these markets by having this abusive control that creates this scenario. So we're not going to get rid of this unless we have a brand new Congress, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not by the super PACs, for the super PACs, of the super PACs. That is really the crux of the question here. This is where MMT intersects with the core political problems that we have, which is corruption. Let's name it, right? And let's name names, right? So we can't just say, oh, taking money out of politics, there's corruption in the system, vaguely speaking. We need to have a 21st century Pecora style investigation. My colleague, Bill Black, who's a brilliant economist and legal scholar, and white collar criminologist, was the lead person at the time of the savings and loans crisis, was responsible probably single-handedly for putting hundreds of fraudsters in prison from Wall Street. This is what we need. We need somebody like him, like Bill Black, like Pecora. Pecora was the person who led the investigations during the Great Depression. Without Pecora, I don't think we could have had a New Deal. So Bill Black and myself, we've been talking about this, and we're in consensus. We can't have a Green New Deal unless we have a clean New Deal. In other words, weed out the corruption and the power and influence of Wall Street, of big oil, of big pharma from the political system, precisely because of this point that I'm making here, because it is the system that's suffocating the spending capacity of the government. So I'm happy to elaborate on this as we go. So this is the paradigm shift that we're talking about. It's not about the idea that the government can spend. Even the mainstream economists and politicians tell you, of course, we know the government can spend, but they don't want to get into the details. They just claim, well, if we spend too much, it's going to cause inflation. And trust us, we're the Harvard economists. We'll tell you about the inflation when we see it, and we kind of see it around the corner. So, take my word for it. Call their bluff. So what we're saying essentially is we want to decouple the spending at the federal level from taxation. Both are important. And I'll emphasize this. Spend on national priorities, on health and education, on infrastructure, on climate policies, and so on. That's how we decide what we're going to spend on. Whereas today, what we do is we think about how much money do we have, and then think about, oh, how are we going to use this money to spend on all these priorities? We're thinking backwards. So leave the taxes aside for a second. Spend on the priorities, just like we did during World War II. We didn't say, oh, World War II is too expensive, we can't afford it, we're going to send them just 10,000 troops and see if we can win. That's not how you do it, right? And then tax pollution because we want to decarbonize, tax speculation because we want to stabilize the economy, tax extreme wealth because we want to protect democracy from oligarchy, not because we need their money or their permission to fund the Green New Deal or healthcare or education. So that's what we mean by decoupling taxation and spending. Spend on priorities, tax because it's important to save democracy, because it's important to democratize, because it's important to stabilize the economy and reduce inequality and so on. Not because we need their money or their permission for this. Tax to reduce the abusive market power that they have and influence in politics. So these are the goals of taxation, not because we need their money to fund the Green New Deal. A lot of people think of MMT, oh, MMTers, they just want to spend, 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 and they say you don't need taxes. I say it repeatedly, tax the hell out of the system, but for good reasons, not because you think we need their money or their permission. Set the national priorities. For me, it's universal public services first, meaning green infrastructure, Medicare for all, housing for all, education for all, childcare services, you name it. All the progressive agenda that many of our friends in this movement have on their platforms. That's step number one. Step number two, introduce a federal job guarantee. And I mentioned earlier that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley introduced this fantastic federal job guarantee resolution that I urge all of you to look at, and maybe somebody's dropping it in the chat as we speak. A job guarantee with a living wage and benefits for people who want to work. Lots of people want to work. And even during the pandemic, by the way, a lot of people told me, oh, this job guarantee you talk about during the pandemic, how does it work? And I'm like, the most important job during the pandemic for those who can't work remotely is to stay home. So that's a paid job too. That's how you save the country from the spread of the disease, is by practicing social distancing and staying safe and taking care of your family. For me, that's a job guarantee. It's not welfare spending, it's not subsidies, it's a job guarantee. And many jobs, as we've discovered during the pandemic, can be done remotely and can be done with proper sanitation and social distancing and so on. On a side note here, my colleagues and I have been involved in a study called the Green Jobs Report. We do a monthly webinar on esgx.org. And I'll drop maybe a link to one of our pieces. The summary of the piece is the following. And the summary of all the research we've been doing since last year is that we're finding that greener jobs are more resilient during the pandemic, which means when we lost jobs across the board, we lost fewer jobs in the green industries. Number two, when the economy reopened, the recovery of the greener jobs was much faster than the extractive industries or the brown industries. And then number three, we found that within the high contact industries are industries where coworkers are literally within an arm's length of each other. That's the workplace environment. We found that even within those high contact industries, we found that greener jobs are actually more resilient and safer. So it's a no-brainer. And we also found that greener jobs, by the way, pay better in general compared to other jobs. So we have a blueprint for what kinds of jobs we want for a resilient economy. It's the greener jobs. And this is something that a job guarantee must embrace. And that's why we insist within the Green New Deal, the job guarantee is not a nice add-on. It's a core feature for that just transition, for greening the economy, decarbonizing, and so on. And bringing living wages, not just minimum wage at 15, which as we speak, it looks like the Senate is not interested in that at the moment. The third layer is a generous income support system for people who cannot work or should not work for health reasons and so on. So nobody's left behind in this way of thinking of public policy. Universal services, jobs for people who can't find work in the private sector but want to work. And then the third layer, a generous income support for people who can't work, with true full employment and true prosperity for everyone. So the mainstream economists, when they think about inflation, this is what they've been saying lately. They recognize, they've acknowledged that they have no reliable theory of inflation. This is from the Fed. This is not me or the MMT economists. The mainstream of the profession gave up. If you watch the testimony of the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, Jerome Powell, just 2 days ago, he literally told Congress all of those old theories that we've studied when we were young in school about inflation, about, you know, if the federal government spends too much, if the national debt is too high, that it's going to cause inflation, it's going to cause high interest rates. He told them none of that is true. That is the establishment of mainstream economics is saying our theory of inflation doesn't make any sense. And they're not saying this because they want MMT or support MMT or want a Green New Deal. It's because the evidence showed them in the last decade, at least, that theory of inflation, that too much spending will cause inflation, is not true. The best case in point is Japan. Japan has been stuck in a cycle of deflation despite massive government spending since the 1990s for decades. Guess what? They have deflation and they have negative interest rates. Whereas the standard theory says if the government has a large national debt like Japan, it should have hyperinflation and it should have excessively high interest rates. The ECB is in the same boat. This is what the ECB economists have been consistently forecasting. They've consistently forecasted, these dotted lines are the forecast at the time. They forecast inflation to go this way and inflation goes that way. They forecast inflation to go up and it stays down, go up and go down. Month after month, year after year, for more than a decade, the predictions of standard theory about what causes inflation is completely off. But the MMT economists and the MMT perspective that I presented earlier has been proven true again and again. So time to shift gears. So now to zoom in on what we mean by inflation in the economics profession versus the rest of us in the general public, and I'll close in a few minutes because I can't skip this part because this is very important for public policy. We have 4 areas that actually drive inflation in the US. Even though the actual inflation rate that the Fed looks at, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes, is actually very low, but you and I know that the cost of living has been going up. So these are the 4 areas that drive inflation: healthcare, education, housing, energy, and transportation. These are the areas that are inflating and close to hyperinflating. This is the real burden that working class and middle class people feel and on their paycheck and on their budget. That's why the Green New Deal program that we've been advocating for includes these 4 components: Medicare for all, college and vocational training for all, home guarantees, rent control, decarbonizing the whole system, the energy and transportation system. This is not just a nice shopping list for the progressive movement. These are core features that are included in the Green New Deal so that we actually tackle the risk of inflation. Remember what we said earlier? The risk of inflation is lack of productive capacity and abusive market power. So for each one of these areas, if we don't increase productive capacity in health, education, housing, energy, and transportation, and most importantly, if we don't tax and regulate their market power, we're going to see more inflation with the Green New Deal. So that's why my worst nightmare is a Green New Deal that spends and spends and spends and spends, but doesn't tackle the market power in these 4 areas. So it's all one package, not because it's a shopping list of the progressive movement, but because there are core features that are essential to allow us that prosperity and stability without the risk of inflation. So that's for me, it's crucial, right? So market power and productive capacity is the name of the game when it comes to tackling the risk of inflation and allowing us to spend in a way that that we're able to without bankrupting the country, without causing inflation. So when they say we can't afford it, when they say the deficit is too big, when they say the national debt is too high, I like to shift the narrative, right, on these things, change the narrative. So when they tell you we can't afford it. I say, yeah, we can't afford all of these negative effects of unemployment, of pollution, the cancer treatments, the opioid crisis. All of these things are unaffordable. They're massively expensive. What I always say is the cost of doing nothing is way more expensive than the cost of doing the right thing, which is the Green New Deal. That is actually the cheaper version, the more prosperous version than what we're doing already. We're paying, and this is not me, the White House actually under the Obama White House, and then the project was finished under the Trump White House and was published under the Trump White House, $2.5 trillion spending in a 4-year period just on the opioid crisis. Like, that's affordable. Like, that's nice for the economy to experience, or for society, or for communities and families to experience that pain. That's what's not affordable. So change the narrative about what is affordable. When they say the deficit is too big, yeah, I agree. The infrastructure deficit, the healthcare deficit, the educational deficits, the green renewable energy deficits, these are the deficits that matter, not the federal government deficit. The private sector deficit matters to me. Household credit card debt, student loan debt, these are the debts that matter, not the national debt. The climate debt, the colonial debt, the reparations debts, these are the debts that matters. These are the issues that we need to focus on as progressives. And we can afford all of these things. What we can't afford is the status quo. This is what we can't afford. These are the things that we can't afford, and they're all over the country in terms of pollution and of the water, of the soil, of the land, the forest fires, the floods, the climate crisis that we're dealing with. That's the unaffordable part. So change the narrative. And the metric that we use in the economics profession, and then politics obviously uses this metric, is economic growth. When we say economic growth, they're talking about this line: GDP, gross domestic product, produce, 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 and sell, sell, sell. GDP essentially is the sum total of all goods and services that we produce annually in the United States. And that is perceived as the engine of the economy that produces wealth. What some ecological economists have done is produce an alternative measure. I call it the cousin of GDP, the closest cousin, which is take the GDP numbers, these numbers that have been growing for decades, and then strip all the negative effects out of them. For example, every time we have an oil spill and we spend $300 million to clean it up, GDP goes up by $300 million because that's spending, right? But does that improve our quality of life? Of course it doesn't. So this alternative measure, GPI, gross genuine progress indicator, takes that out of the GDP number and of course reduces the number. Every time we decide we're not going to spend on clean energy because it's too expensive, and we end up with polluted soil and water and air, we end up spending hundreds of millions and billions of dollars over the next several years and decades on cancer treatment, on breathing conditions, on hospital visits. All of that shows up as positive numbers in GDP. It gets celebrated on TV as economic growth, more prosperity, but that's a reduction in our quality of life. So GPI takes those numbers out. And look at that. If you start stripping GDP of all the negative effects, we end up with a flat quality of life for decades. No improvement in quality of life. And when you split this by income level, as you would probably guess, the lowest income groups have experienced an actual decline in quality of life because this pollution effect, these things have dimensions that are essentially class-based and race-based. So the most vulnerable members of society are the ones who suffer the most. So what we're talking about here is changing the narrative, changing the metric so that the goals of our public policy become very clear. We want to improve quality of life. We don't want to increase GDP for the sake of increasing GDP. And as the phrase goes, economic growth or growth for its own sake is the ideology of a cancer cell. Is that what we want? Obviously not. And once we change the metric and the goals, the policy solutions become so obvious that if we want GPI to increase, the quality of life index to increase, then we should invest in people. We should invest in health. We should invest in green infrastructure. And that is essentially the Green New Deal proposal, is to invest in the things that actually improve quality of life, not just GDP. And then finally, to conclude, We have less than 10 years to act on a massive scale, not to think, not to plan, not to debate, act on a massive scale. The climate crisis, inequality, poverty, exclusion, all the injustice, all of these things call for urgent and bold actions, not small incremental action. The current policies on climate, on jobs are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. They don't even work, which makes these policies dangerous. Incrementalism is dangerous at this time. Economic justice and climate justice for me via a living wage Green New Deal are possible, desirable, and affordable. It's the current status quo that's actually unaffordable. And with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions. I think Jason will go through the chat and sort them out.
All right, thank you so much, Fadhel.
Thank you.
Before we get to those questions, I want to talk about just what we saw here today, and that was first of all, Fadhel, you're such an amazing presenter.
Thank you.
And I have said, and not jokingly, that there are two people I can listen to all day long, Bernie Sanders and Fadhel Kaboub, because when I first saw you present this about a year ago, you were working with Brand New Congress, and you were giving this presentation to a number of candidates, I believe, so that they could go out there and explain in their candidacies how we are going to pay for it. Now, I was not a Brand New Congress candidate myself. I hope that will change this time around. But once I, as a candidate, felt like I had a handle on what you were talking about, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to share it everywhere. It was revelatory. And so I thank you for last June. You did the forum with me and Russ Cirincione and Zena Spazakis and Hector Oseguera, Sakina Latolo. We had these, and Jen Perelman, and we had this conversation, and it was amazing. And I'm looking at the chat here, and I'm looking at the chat on Facebook, and I see people with these comments that are just, wow, we have had the capacity to do this all the time. What we need now, again, as I said at the opening, is we need the political will to do this. And the way that you do this is that you have candidates who are running without taking that corporate money. And so I want to put a pitch out there, not to myself particularly, but I have run on no corporate money precisely because I don't want to be bound to those power influences that are not going to really allow me as an elected official, if I get that far, to push for these things. They're going to push back on this, and they're going to say to me as a candidate, we're not going to fund you anymore if you're going to take away our profits. And if we go back to the GDP, GPI thing, I look at that gap between GDP and GPI as in itself an argument for raising the minimum wage. Where is all that productive capacity going? It's going into the pockets of CEOs. It is not going into the pockets of the average person so that they can improve their quality of life. I mean, that one graphic in and of itself is just an amazing argument for having everybody have more income. And the other graphic that you have used before and that I really enjoy comes from Paulina Chernova, where she shows that over the last 100 years, I think it was, that as we go through this sort of capitalist boom and bust cycle, where we end up with recessions every so often, that as our government has put back into our economy, they have more and more increasingly put it in the pockets of the wealthy rather than the working class and the majority of people. I'm wondering if you could just take a brief second. I don't know if you have that graph, but if you could talk about it, I would love to see that. It's
coming up in just 1 second.
I would love to show that to people, and I would like you to talk about that graph. And just this graph for me connects that need to tax the more powerful so that they don't have the market power to do what we're seeing.
All right, so thank you, Jason. It's very kind of you, and I'm glad you mentioned this. So many people are familiar with this picture. Can you see my wages and productivity picture here?
Yeah, we can see that.
So since the 1980s, we see that wages have gone flat and productivity continues to go up. So where are the gains from productivity going? They're going to the top 1%. That's what's building this inequality in the system. And you've seen pictures like this, the inequality index going up. You've seen pictures like this, income distribution and all of this. But the picture that you're referring to, Pavlina's chart, which
That's the one. Yeah.
Which Bernie Sanders presented on the floor of the Senate. Actually, you've seen pictures of Bernie with this graph and Stephanie Kelton sitting by his side. Let me outline what this picture is about. Think of it this way. We're looking at every single recession we've had since the 1940s, 1950s, and we're looking at the recovery, not the recession, the recovery. Who's gaining from the recovery? Where are the benefits of the recovery going? Are they going to the blue bars, which is the bottom 90% of the population? That's us. Or are they going to the top 10% of the population? It used to be the case back in the day, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It used to be that most of the gains, like 80, 70%, go to the bottom 80% and 90%. And then the rich, the 10%, they used to get quite a bit, right? And notice the red bars keep going up. And notice the blue bars keep getting smaller and smaller. The big turning point is 1980s, the Reagan kind of supply side economics, neoliberal movement. And we thought that it couldn't get worse than this, as in the rich getting almost 100% of the gains and the rest of us, 90% of the population, getting like 1%. And in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, we went into new uncharted territory, where we've actually lost ground in the recovery, not during the crisis. These are the years of the recovery, and the rich have accumulated more than 100%. They've actually taken away from whatever we had left.
Bernie talked about this. Bernie talked about
Absolutely.
this often on his stump speech.
Right.
Coming out of the recession, he talked about how the bottom 50% have lost somewhere in the neighborhood of $900 billion of wealth.
But here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. We haven't done anything policy-wise to undo the engine that produces this, which means as we speak, this crisis, as we recover from it, I guarantee you we're going to see something like this, if not worse, which means policy solutions to take the existing engine of the economy and replace it with something cleaner, more equitable. That's why in the MMT community, we don't talk about redistribution. Redistribution means you tax the rich and distribute to the poor. Like after they've taken, we say, oh, that's too much. That's unfair. Let's give the poor a little bit. No. We're not talking about redistribution. We're talking about pre-distribution. You spend money the right way to begin with. So we're not talking about keeping the engine of the economy that produces pollution, that produces inequality, that produces exclusion. We're talking about changing the engine of the economy so that it produces cleaner stuff, more equitable stuff, more just outcome, more inclusive outcome to begin with. So that's really important for the progressives, for anybody who cares about justice, right? To think about these radical solutions. Radical meaning going to the roots of the problem. Redistribution for me is still window dressing. It's just saying, well, the system is messed up. Let's clean it up a little bit here and there every now and then.
Thank you. So we do have a few questions in the chat, and Nicholas has a number of questions, and I think I want to go to.
Actually, Jason, did we want to look at it?
Yeah. Sorry.
Sharon and Michael are ready, we want to do just a little quick music break, so everybody get your questions together. We do have Q&A. Jason, I'll make you a co-host so you can see those and take those as well. Sharon and Michael. Okay, you ready?
This is a short little song. We like to do jingles that get into people's ears like little earworms, and they can't get them out. And help remember things. And
this song speaks to the fact that MMT at its base is not a program. It's an understanding of how things actually work. This is how they work, whether you like it or not. So Absolutely. That's what this little song is insisting upon.
And if you can't get it out of your head, please don't hate us. We just want to get it. We just want to get the word out there. Okay. Woo! Let's get up there. Here we go. Ready? 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. if you don't let the brake from the steering wheel. Don't try to drive an automobile if you don't understand MMT. Don't try to run the economy. Hey, we got to do this again. Ready? Because we can't remember it. Well, it's new.
We wrote this today.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3. If you don't the brake from the steering wheel, don't try to drive an automobile if you don't understand MMT. Don't try to run the national economy. MMT, MMT, modern monetary theory. MMT, MMT, modern monetary theory. Oh, it is so. Oh, it is so. When you understand MMT, you understand the national economy. When you understand MMT, you understand the national economy. MMT, MMT, modern monetary theory. MMT, MMT, modern monetary theory.
All right. Thank you, Sharon and Michael. Appreciate it. Thank you. So going back to the chat, I want to go to a question that I'm not sure I understand, so I'm going to put it out there. Nicholas
Jason,
talks
if
about
you don't mind, I'm dropping in the chat a Green New Deal song by my friend Alan Schwartz. It's also MMT inspired song, so
I'll make
enjoy
sure
it.
to play that before we leave tonight. We'll play it for
Wonderful.
everyone.
Okay, yeah, we'll close out with that. Good deal. So Nicholas asked about the Cantillon effect, asking if it's a valid critique of MMT or the spending that would happen if Congress realized MMT as a fact. I don't know what that is, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit and answer that question.
Well, maybe Nicholas should elaborate on what he means by the Cantillon effect.
Nicholas, if you can sort of elaborate on that in the chat there, I can come back to that. So another one that comes up often, Catherine asks, why does the news always say that we owe so much money to China? Where is the sleight of hand on that? How are people misinterpreting this? I've heard your explanation before.
Sure. Yeah. That's a classic, misrepresentation of reality. Remember what I said earlier? We said we want to make a clear distinction between the issuer of the currency, the federal government, versus the rest of us users of the currency. So anybody who thinks that we owe money to China and that without borrowing money from China, we can't spend, is treating the federal government like a household, like a state or municipality that needs to borrow money first in order to spend. So let's think about it clearly. China is the second largest economy in the world. China is a major exporter. It's an export-driven economy. And the US dollar dominates the global trading system. So naturally, as a major exporter, China earns a lot of dollars. Makes sense, right? So now, if you have lots and lots of dollars coming in as income, and you're not going to spend all of it right away, you need to save it someplace safe. Where would you put it? Or not under the mattress, obviously. You're going to put it in some bank account. You can put it in a bank account that earns 0 interest, or you can use it to invest in some speculative, risky business like Bitcoin or something, or you can buy the safest asset on the planet, AAA rated asset that never defaults whatsoever, and that's called US Treasury bonds. That's why China saves its surplus, its trade surplus, in US dollars. It's not borrowing, it's not lending, it's a savings account that the US federal government offers to everybody, anybody, including China, right? Well, guess what? Before China was the second largest economy in the world, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. And guess what? Those same comments were applied to Japan, that the Japanese are taking over our economy. We owe so much money to Japan. Makes sense because they're a major exporter. They need to park their money somewhere safe. And that's the US bonds, US treasuries. So all of this talk about borrowing money from China and all that is nonsense. We're not borrowing from China. China is parking its export revenues in US markets. There's no risk of default. There's no risk of speculation against the U.S. economy or any of that nonsense.
And there's no risk of China, quote unquote, owning the U.S. because they own so much of our treasuries.
Absolutely.
So Tanish has a question here. How do we plan to get around the Byrd rule and pay-go to actually get policies passed?
Yeah, a little bit ago, I dropped a little article that I wrote for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in the New York office. And I think I called it the MMT Insights for the Biden administration or something like that. So the pay-go rules, and I talk about the pay-go rules in it and what we can do with those. The pay-go rules, for people who are not familiar with the term, are these rules that Congress introduced, I should say artificially, added artificial constraints on itself that says, we want to be fiscally responsible. We want to be fiscally conservative. So here's what we're going to do. We're not going to spend on any new program unless we cancel another program. So we need to find the money for it to pay for it, either with canceling another program or introducing a new tax revenue stream to pay for it. Well, the good news is that this year, Congress introduced an exception to the pay-go rules. The exemptions to pay-go rules are pandemic spending and climate infrastructure spending, which means as long as we can justify, at least under these artificial rules that Congress keeps creating for itself, those two areas are exempt from pay-go rules. So that's good news in the short term. In the long term, we just need to get rid of the pay-go rules. If you understand what I presented today, the MMT approach, that Congress has the power of the purse, why would you decide to sit on your hands and then say, I can't move? Why would you decide to tie your own hands, artificially create these nonsensical constraints and essentially throw millions of people under the bus and say, sorry, we can't afford it, right? So that's what we're talking about here. And I think a better informed public, a better informed set of candidates in media is really helping us shift this narrative.
Thank you. I have Tanish asked another question. Is there any state that's acting on this? And obviously MMT is federal policy, not state policy. But I wonder if we can talk about the relationship between, because I think maybe this will somewhat answer that question as well. But I've been wondering about, we talk about states needing to live within certain constrained budgets. If the states are using the dollars, and we're all under this federal umbrella, when we talk about a state going bankrupt, is that even a real thing? Is this something where, if we're talking about the states spending where they need to spend and spending so that they are helping people and making these infrastructure changes that we need, is there anything preventing the federal government from, quote unquote, bailing them out, almost continuously? Like, the state is an agent of change and can be an agent of positive change. And does the state really need to worry about this if the federal government can come in and just say, listen, we'll make sure that you have the money to do what you need to do?
Absolutely. States, and we've learned this publicly, or relearned this publicly, when Mitch McConnell a few months ago told states, go file for bankruptcy. Don't expect any help from us, right? That is true. If states have no capacity to create money, and if markets are not there to provide any capital up to a certain limit, and if the tax base is weak during a pandemic, during a major crisis, where will you get the money from to spend, right? So states are constrained in that sense. Some of you know some of what I've said earlier about states being able to create complementary currencies and things like that. That's also an option. But to answer your question, Jason, directly, or I can't remember who asked this question, the federal government has a responsibility to step in and spend on infrastructure, spend on health, spend on these priorities. And that's really the Green New Deal program. That's why we're saying this burden can't be put on states and municipalities in terms of raising taxes and so on. But I'll also add one more component here, that the Federal Reserve Bank has the capacity to support states and municipalities today on the climate front in terms of helping support green infrastructure. So there's a green bonds market, right? And states and municipalities can go in and invest in water infrastructure, energy infrastructure at the state and city level. The Federal Reserve Bank, as part of its current policies, they don't have to change any policy. They buy massive amounts of bonds on a monthly basis. They can buy green bonds and they can target municipal green bonds to support the building of that infrastructure, because the firepower of the Fed is massive. So it can lean into those markets and lower the cost of borrowing for municipalities across the system, right? So even if Congress and the Senate fails to do the right thing, the Fed today can do it. They just opt not to up to this point. Maybe they will. I'm seeing a slight change of perspective within the Fed, and I'll tell you why this is happening. The IPCC report that came out a few years ago said 12 years, massive intervention, ring the alarm bells, right? We all remember that. So meaning we have less than 10 years today. A year or two after that, all the major investment banks on Wall Street and insurance companies started doing research internally on climate risks, not because they're tree huggers, but because they worry about the financial losses that they will actually face. And JP Morgan produced a report last year, almost a year ago, that was leaked to the press. The Guardian has an article about it. And they said, you know what, that IPCC report, those guys are optimistic. It's actually much worse than that. And the financial losses are potentially massive. So there's this concept that we call the carbon bubble. You're familiar with the financial market, stock market bubble, right? That assets are overpriced and then they crash when we figure out the true value. Well, the carbon bubble is the value of all of these, assets that are overpriced today because of the carbon economy. Think of all the coastal properties around the world, including in the US, hotels and resorts and businesses that are valued at trillions of dollars. Their value will go to zero when they're flooded. I see a flooded street behind you, Jason, right? So those become stranded assets that are worth nothing. The most conservative estimate I've seen, we're talking about $20 to $30 trillion worth of stranded assets. Coastal properties in the US, by the year 2045, we're going to lose $1 trillion worth of just real estate in the United States, not globally. So all of those losses are actually sitting as financial assets on the books of investment banks and insurance companies today. So guess what? They're panicking. And as they started panicking the last 2 years, as they did these studies, they started talking to the Fed and saying, we need to do something about it. Not to save the planet, but to save ourselves. So guess what? The Fed finally realized that something needs to be done. And the ECB at the same time, the European Central Bank. In July, the European Central Bank finally joined NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a network of central banks and financial regulators who are actually panicking about this. The first one was the Bank of England 10 years ago, I think, started this. And now the Fed finally joined in September, I think, and the Fed started issuing its first statements and speeches about climate change and financial risks. So far, it's been speeches, but I think they will soon take action. And one of the immediate things they can do today is go into the green bond market and encourage states and municipalities to take matters into their own hands, at least to build resilient infrastructure, at least to support the weatherization of homes and the production of renewable energy in states and municipalities. There's plenty of low-hanging fruits that we can do immediately. But of course, in a democracy, we have those 535 people that we elect to do these things. But we need to work on all fronts because we can't afford to wait anymore.
Well, it shows you who's in control of the markets and the political system also. But that is, I want to say that just hearing that right there, I mean, that is a cause for some optimism in terms of our long-range tackling of the climate crisis. And it's interesting that you did notice the flooded street behind me. I'm going to move out of the way. But That's my little political snark right there. When we talk about how rapidly we actually need to manage our climate crisis, and in the end, when everything flooded, it was all because the Bernie Bros were too aggressive. We're gonna let the
Yep.
system fall apart. But that's just my
I'm
personal political
dropping
thought.
one of the most recent statements from the Fed on climate change and financial risks in the chat here.
Fantastic.
This is just
Thank
a
you.
few days ago, so it's happening. It's going to happen, but hopefully sooner rather than later.
That's really good to hear. Stephen had a question in the chat that says, "Is the inflation measure used being is the inflation measure used being wrong, similar to an employment rate looking only at claims?" Stephen, I think can you elaborate on that question? Um, uh, so I think it says, "Is the inflation measure wrong
Yeah.
when they're looking at unemployment?"
I think I get the intuition behind the message.
Okay.
As a metaphor, yes, I agree, but it's actually much worse than that. The comparison is much worse when it comes to inflation. It's just there's this implicit assumption that automatically when there's more spending, there's more money in the system, it's going to inflate, and it's really an ideology or a myth that's based on the old gold standard that we used to have. Back in the day, actual paper money was backed by a physical limited quantity of gold that the king had, or that the government or the central bank had. So when you print more paper money into circulation, but you have the same quantity of gold, you've just devalued those paper units, right? And that's what inflation is. But today we live in a world where paper money is not backed by anything. No gold, no silver, no Bitcoin, nothing. It's fiat money. So its value is not derived from any intrinsic object, precious metal, or anything. I mean, paper money is worthless. Today, we're talking about digital dollars, right? It's electronic transactions. You don't even see dollars when you get paid and when you spend. Most of it is debit and credit card transactions. So there's no intrinsic value. So what gives the dollar its value is this productive economy that we have. The best metaphor that I think many people will connect with here is the following. We say that the government, the federal government, is the equivalent of the scorekeeper at a football game, right? What does a scorekeeper do at a football game? Do they show up with a bag of points in the beginning of the game and say, today we only have 10 points to spend. So if you score more than 10, too bad. We're going to have to stop the game. That's not how we do it. We have certain rules. The two teams play on the field. There are certain rules. If they do the right thing and they score, the scorekeeper will give them a point, right? If they follow the rules, right? And the scorekeeper can never run out of points. Think of the government as the scorekeeper for the economy. It can never run out of points. If we do the right thing, which is produce health and education and all the economic activity that we do to serve the public purpose, to live in prosperity, the government will give us credit, will give us points, just like the scorekeeper. And if we do the wrong thing, the government can take away credit from you, can penalize you, right? So it's a scorekeeper. It can never run out of those units of account, right? And it doesn't need to borrow units of account from the Chinese football league, right? Or any other football league. You have your own points. You're a scorekeeper. So that's a better metaphor for what we're doing here. And if we artificially say, wait a minute, I'm the scorekeeper and I'm going to restrain myself with a pay-go rule that says I will not issue more than 10 points per day, then all of those useful, productive activities that we're engaged in at some point will reach an end. And your employer will say, you know what? There is no money in the system. The economy is stagnating. I can't hire more workers because the system is reaching that limit that the government imposed on it. But if we fuel the economy with enough resources, we can reach our fullest potential. So that scorekeeper has, technically speaking, an infinite number of points that they could spend. It doesn't mean we should spend unlimited points. It doesn't mean we should be handing points left and right when the game hasn't actually scored, when the teams have not scored the right points. You should give the appropriate quantity of points or amount of points based on what's actually happening in the economy. So one of my friends uses this beautiful metaphor, and Imagine you have access to the biggest lake of fresh water in your backyard. It's massive, unlimited. Does that mean you should drink all of it? Does that mean you should use all of it to flood your farm? Of course not. That's the wrong thing to do. You should drink enough so that you're not dehydrated. You should give everybody in your community so that they're not dehydrated. You should use a sufficient amount of water to water your plants so they don't die. That's what we have access to that lake for. Don't flood it to destroy the system, and don't dehydrate the system either. So just spend enough to keep us alive and prosperous and so on.
And that's another argument for having a Congress that is not bought and buying into, you know, crony capitalism, where the wrong people, you know, do get the points, or they get points that they haven't earned, and, you know, they build their wealth and power that way, and are able to continue manipulating the system so that they get ever increasing amounts of points. So very cogent there. So Yasser asked a question here, which is along the lines of something that I was wondering. When you talked about World War II, and part of the reason for selling treasury bonds is to limit consumption. You want to encourage people not to consume so that we don't get inflation. Yasser's question says, how can we guarantee that we're not exhausting our resources and pushing too much? We already expanded our money supply by more than 25% within a year. What about stagflation risk and can't produce more, especially with zombie companies that took advantage of this stage? So can you answer that? I mean, how does pushing too much sort of gel with this idea of we want to make sure that we are encouraging a limit on consumerism and general consumption?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer, because there was quite a few themes there, so I'm not sure exactly where to go with it, but I think I know what's implied by this question. So I'll start with consumerism. Obviously, many of us in the MMT community on the ecological front, we're not pro-consumerism. We're not saying let's build more, let's do the old-fashioned, stimulate the economy to produce more, to create jobs. As I said earlier, we should go after the low-hanging fruits. We should reduce our consumption of energy. We should improve efficiency, because at this rate, there is no future for the planet, for humanity, if everybody consumes at the rate that we're consuming at in the United States, with all the plastic waste and so on. So definitely not pro-consumerism. If anything, shifting the way we consume and produce energy and move people and products around the world. On the World War II case, yes, we wanted to reduce consumption at the time because the raw materials were scarce. We needed rubber for military. We needed steel and metal and all kinds of inputs. And we needed physical labor, human labor, to be directed for those purposes. It wasn't just selling US treasuries to do that, by the way. We even had to go further with price controls, with actual controls
rationing
of actual quantities, rationing quantities of key commodities in order to keep inflation under control and in order to keep the supply lines for the war effort fully stocked, right? So we're not saying this is what we need to do immediately, like right now. But maybe at some point, if we're really serious about this climate crisis, maybe we need to think carefully about which resources we really need to mobilize to accelerate the green transition. We need massive amount of research and development to improve efficiency, because with the current technology that we have, we can go far, but not fully far enough to produce what I call a circular economy. I want every product that we currently buy from the store, your cell phone, your keyboard, or whatever you buy, comes in a little box with the user manual that says this is how you use it and all that. I want that user manual to include a living will that says this is what you do with me when you're done with me as an object. There's going to be a whole other system that gives me a new life, a new purpose, to reintroduce that object into a circular economy, which means we need to build the infrastructure for that circular economy, and we need to do massive amount of research and development in material science to make sure that we're not constantly digging mines to produce more stuff to fill landfills, right? So that's a whole other universe of research that we haven't even tapped into. Just the solar panels that we're currently installing as we speak, with all the toxic stuff that's embedded in them, what are we going to do with those in 35 years when they become obsolete? We don't even have a plan. We don't even have research and development to reintroduce the components into a new, and those are precious raw materials, right? Rare earth materials and so on. Very toxic, very precious. We can't afford not to think about all those things. So this is where MMT shifts the focus not on the money. Where is the money to pay for this? It's how do we actually do this to save our lives in terms of actual technology and resources and organization of how we organize society. Those are really the challenging questions. The easy part is finding the money. We know how to find the money.
Fantastic. So Nicholas clarified a little bit of what he was asking earlier with the Cantillon effect. He says a lot of MMT critics talk about the Cantillon effect making the prescriptions of MMT not good, which he says he doesn't agree with. He says the Cantillon effect refers to the change in relative prices resulting from a change in money supply. So is that enough for you to go on there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is related to the point I made earlier about the gold standard. If your theory of money is based on the value of money is derived from a fixed quantity of gold, and if you increase the quantity of money in circulation, but you don't have additional gold, you've devalued it and you've caused inflation. We don't have a gold standard. The reason why we were able to enter and win World War II is because we got rid of the gold standard. No country can enter into a massive spending effort like World War II or a New Deal or a Green New Deal if you tie physically, I mean, not physically, but if you fix the value of your currency to a commodity like gold. That's just the ultimate pay-go rule, which says you cannot increase your spending unless you acquire more gold, either through exports or through mining or through invading other countries and taking their gold, which is what colonialism did for a long time, is invading countries and digging their mines and taking their gold. None of that is relevant in our system today.
Okay, thank you. John asked the question, is there a level when servicing the interest payments on our national debt becomes dangerous to our progressive agenda and the economy, or is this just another Republican and neoliberal diversion?
Yeah, it's definitely not Republican, because Democrats also have this belief. That piece that I dropped earlier in the chat, I actually addressed this issue of the interest rate, and as I say in that piece, it's really Democrats that I'm worried about more than Republicans on this front, because you hear a lot of fiscally conservative Democrats and economists like Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard and at Harvard, who are saying this, large deficits and national debt, and the spending today is affordable only because the interest rates are low. But as soon as interest rates go up, that debt burden is going to be more expensive, and we're not going to afford it. And this is what I express in that piece. I argue that we have a very small window of opportunity right now, and it's less than a year and a half, literally, to do what we're trying to do. Because by the time we get to the 2022 election cycle, the Republicans are going to hit the media and the campaign trail with deficits and debt, and we're going bankrupt, and China is owning us, right? And then some Democrats, quite a few Democrats, will cave in and will counter campaign with, I'm more fiscally conservative than you. We're going to try to balance the budget and do this and do that. And that's just dangerous, based on everything I discussed today. So the argument that cheap interest rates is what allows us to spend is like shooting yourself in the foot. Who determines the interest rate? It's the Fed. It's a policy variable that we determine for ourselves, right? Forget about who determines the interest rate. The debt payment or the debt service that the federal government pays, that the US Treasury pays, US Treasury has the power of the purse. Congress has the power of the purse. It can never run out of its own dollars, right? So the fact that there is more interest payment or less interest payment doesn't change anything in the reality that the federal government can always meet its debt commitments. Look at Japan. I mean, people are worried about the US. Look at Japan, 250% debt to GDP ratio, the largest in the world. Japan was downgraded by credit rating agencies multiple times. They reached a debt to GDP ratio of 100% and they said, Japan is going to default. Everybody, if you have Japanese bonds, go sell them because the country's going bankrupt. And those who sold lost a lot of money because there is no way for Japan to default. They issue the yen. When those payments come due, they can always meet the payments. And they've always done that. And then the Japanese debt to GDP ratio reached 160%. They said, this is it. Japan is bankrupt. Tomorrow they're going to file for bankruptcy. Of course not. Today it's 250%, and they're still saying Japan is going to default. They're saying the same about the US government. None of it is true. Why is Japan still stuck in a cycle of deflation? Why is Japan dealing with negative interest rates? Because it has massive productive capacity. Right? Its economy can handle the additional spending, can handle the additional debt, and the entire debt is denominated in its national currency. The countries that can't handle debt are countries that have weak productive capacity, who have to import their own food, their own medicine, their own energy, and they borrow and promise to pay back in a foreign currency, like most developing countries. Those countries face hyperinflation if they have large debt. Those countries face bankruptcy because they literally can't issue US dollars to make their payments. They have to earn those US dollars like you and I. They have to borrow them. They have to earn them through trade or other means in order to make the interest payment. So when the interest payment for a developing country goes up, they're literally broke, right? None of that is valid for the US or Canada or Japan or the UK and so on.
So it seems like our productive capacity is really it hinges on having a well-trained workforce, and then we've got another argument there for making sure everybody can go to school as much as they need to and not be burdened with all of that debt coming out of it. You know, that's just that's an overall strength for our economy, which something has never made sense to me why you wouldn't want a more educated population just as an investment in your society and your economy at large. This gives me an opportunity just because you talked about how, you know, it's inevitable that some Democrats are going to fall back on this argument that, you know, we have to be deficit hawks. In fact, the guy I'm running against, Rick Larson in Washington's 2nd District, has in his last 20 years of office mentioned a number of times in when the deficit becomes part of the conversation that he's willing to put entitlements on the table. It's an awful way to go. He's definitely somebody who I think is gonna, you know, when we talk about how we're gonna pay for it, he's the kind of person who says no, we can't pay for it. So as a lead into maybe, I don't know how much time you have. We're kind of at the end of questions. I don't know if anybody has any really pressing questions, but we've covered a lot of ground. And the one thing that I want to make sure that we leave with is, how do we best sell this to people who are who haven't heard? I mean, for me, I think it's a message that once you hear it and you're thinking about it, it makes perfect sense. But how do you on a large scale, on the scale that you say we need to get this done before the 22 cycle, how do we get that message out there in the way that we need to? What can we do to impress upon our representatives and our president that we have got to spend in this way in order to save our economy and save the planet?
Very good question. So I think the whole thing is about changing the narrative and changing the terms of the debate. And I try to incorporate some of those talking points in my presentation. When they say the deficit is too big, say, yeah, the infrastructure deficit is too big. The educational deficit is too big. I mean, think about it this way. Wouldn't we rather spend a little bit of money on after-school programs and summer camps to inspire kids and teenagers with music and theater and science, or not do that because it's too expensive, and then pay for the opioid crisis and build prisons for those same kids. Now, if you're a fiscally conservative, which one would you rather choose? Which one is the cheaper option, right? Cheaper not just in terms of financial cost, but in terms of human cost and pain for society. Wouldn't we rather clean the water source or not do that because we think it's too expensive and then pay for cancer treatment for everybody in town for the next 40 years, right? Which one is cheaper, right? So the cost of doing nothing is unaffordable. The cost of doing the right thing is much cheaper and much more beautiful and healthy than the cost of doing nothing. So call their bluff when they say we can't afford it. When they say inflation in Zimbabwe and all of that, call their bluff. I mean, I tried to provide as many kind of accessible resources as possible. And if they insist, vote them out of office. That's why we have a democracy.
That's
right?
what we're hoping for here.
Exactly.
And we've said that, you know, I was a high school math teacher for almost 20 years, and we said the cost of ignorance is far higher than the cost of education. But we're seeing that in so many areas right now. It's right in front of our face, and we do have to act quickly. So everybody watching this, the people who are watching this on the live stream, the people who are here in the Zoom with us on the webinar, I hope you can take this information and share it with your local communities. That's really, you know, talk to your state level representatives, even though the budget doesn't affect them on the state level. Certainly they need to be educated about this. If they're looking at, you know, climbing the ladder, going from state government to federal government, we want them to go to the federal government being armed with this understanding of how the real economy works. So Fadhel, thank you so much. If you have any closing remarks, please give them to us. But it's been wonderful. It's fantastic to listen to you every time. I feel like I learn 3 or 4 new things, you know, every time I listen to you talk, which is why I keep coming back to build up my own understanding of it so I can go and talk to people about it. But amazing presentation again. Rhonda, Berniecrats, thank you so much for hosting this. Fadhel, I'll give you a couple of last words, and then Rhonda, do you want to play the song at the end?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for hosting this and for all the good work that you're doing. I mean, we're outnumbered in this effort, but with every candidate, with every canvasser, we're knocking on doors, we're changing the narrative, we're asking the right question, we're forcing the incumbents to think differently and to change their positions. We're also educating the media to ask the right questions and to shift the narrative. So keep doing what you're doing. It's unavoidable. This kind of stuff, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And I think that's the power of this message. You know, at some point we'll reach that threshold, and our movement is unstoppable. There's no doubt about it. So with that, I'll leave you with Alan Schwartz, my friend who's an activist and a labor organizer, and is just a wonderful artist. So he wrote this Green New Deal song a couple years ago, inspired by a lot of the work that we're doing together on the Green New Deal, the job guarantee, and kind of this whole movement that all of us have been involved in over the last few years. So enjoy. Thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much, Fadhel.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I'm Alan Schwartz. I work with the Think Tanks on Poverty of Central Ohio. And we work in towns that have been deindustrialized and coal fields that have been abandoned. We work a lot with getting affordable housing, recovery, and reentry, getting people treatment for their addiction. And what we found is that we really need the resources that are made possible by a federal jobs program. Locally, we really can't solve these problems, but with those kinds of resources, we might be able to really do some good. So I'm going to sing you a song called the Green New Deal song, because we're looking at the Green New Deal real seriously as a way to go get those federal funds. Here we go. We need a We need a new deal, yes, yes. We need a brand new deal. We need a new deal indeed. We had that old deal. It was the oil and coal deal. We've got to leave it in the ground. Use solar all around. Save our soul deal. Where you can have a part in God's creation. You can have a hand in saving the nation. A new deal, that's what we need. Yeah, we need a new deal. We need a new deal. Oh, sing it with me. We need a new deal. That's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. A new deal indeed. We had that red deal. It was a better off dead deal. It was that trickle on down. Leaves turn brown. We don't need you hanging around when 26 people own half the wealth. How much money can you use yourself? A new deal, that's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. That's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. A new deal indeed. We had that blue deal. It was a never come true deal. It was that vote for me and then we'll see what I can do deal. They tell me to wait, the check's in the mail, but every time I check I'm just chasing my tail. A new deal, that's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. That's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. A new deal indeed. We need a green deal. Come on, get clean deal. We need an upright, downright job with all your might deal. Well, I'm gonna tell you what we can do. We can have those jobs and save the planet too. A new deal, that's what we need. We need a new deal, yeah, yeah. We need a new deal, We need a new deal. That's what we need. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. We need a new deal. That's what we need. We need a green new deal. That's what we need.
Woo, thank you.
Fantastic.
We'll see you next time. I'm going to stop the live.